Hey, welcome to V46. This video is entitled Molecular Energy. Well, first, look at the cartoon. Yeah, there is a reason that molecular biologists don't write kid songs. Okay, don't be thrown off or nervous about the title of this video, Molecular Energy, because that sounds really complicated and involved, and I don't want you to think of it in those terms. The reason it's called that is we need to distinguish different kinds of energy. If I say energy, you might be thinking about the sun's energy or thermal energy or light energy or nuclear or electric or whatever. You think about energy in a sandwich. And that's what we're focusing on. Where does the energy come from that we need to power our cells? It doesn't come from nuclear energy or even heat energy. It comes from the energy stored in our food, stored in the molecules that make up our food. So let's start with this idea. And again, this looks a little involved, but it's really not that bad. Here is a molecule called ADP. It's adenosine diphosphate. Di means it has two phosphates on it. And here's another phosphate. This is adenosine triphosphate. And if I'm going to draw like this is showing you the adenosine diphosphate part because there's two phosphates. And then this is the third. Here is the point. We need to add this phosphate and attach it to this thing right here. But energy is required to make chemical bonds. We need energy to make that connection happen. And if you want to think of it this way, here is our food. The energy from our food is going to be used to make that connection happen to produce this master molecule called ATP. ATP is a really important energy molecule, and we'll talk about it in more class. But the point is, we have to make this molecule. The only way to make it is to bring in energy, and the energy comes from food. Why we need to make it is when ATP breaks down, and it breaks down to ADP and P, it also can release energy that can be used to do cell work. So when we talk about needing energy, we need energy to make ATP. When energy is released when those chemical bonds of ATP and other molecules are broken, and we end up with that energy which can be used to do cell work. So, to the age-old question, why do you eat? And you say, because I'm hungry. Well, hunger is actually the biological mechanism to make you eat. You have to eat to take in nutrients and to take in energy. So we'll talk more about digestion a little bit later, but that's actually sort of a good segue to this thought. We have to take in organic molecules. When you think about food, you don't say, today I must eat lipids and carbohydrates. You say, I must have eggs, I must have toast, I must have whatever. There are 4 organic molecules that are going to be found in our foods, and 3 of these are going to be quite important for energy. Just recall for a second what we mean by the term organic. Organic means it contains what? It contains carbon. So, and I don't know why I'm trying to write out carbon in this, but these are carbon-containing molecules. And depending upon how they're put together, they contain different amounts of energy. If we break them down, we release that energy, which we can use to make ATP. The ATP, when it's broken down, releases the energy again, so our cells can do work. In this video, we'll talk about carbohydrates. We'll talk about the other ones in a future video, but carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are the 4 primary organic molecules. And again, just to flip back for a second, you see examples of these: cellulose, glucose, cholesterol, coconut oil. These are examples. Hexokinase, keratin, DNA, RNA, some other ones that you've already heard of before. These are organic molecules because they contain carbon. 3 of these are going to be quite important and that we catabolize, that we break down for energy. So let's just start with that idea. You eat something. You don't eat proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, nucleic acids. You eat a granola bar. You eat a cheeseburger. You eat a piece of fruit. What happens to it And how do we measure how much energy is contained in a food? If you think about that idea, apples contain energy, so does chocolate cake. How do we measure, or what's the quantity we use or we assign, which reflects how much energy is in that food? It's a representation we use with calories. Calories is a measure of energy content of food. So chocolate cake contains more calories, so chocolate cake contains more energy that we can use for our work. Apples contain less. So you're thinking, great, I must eat more chocolate cake because I need more energy. Well, there's also energy intake versus energy use. And if you don't use all the energy you take in, then we know what happens to it. And we'll talk about that also in a future video. But for now, let's just focus on one of these groups. Focus on carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the body's main energy currency. This is what the body would prefer to break down of all the other ones. Again, we have carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates is number one in the body's chemistry, what the body wants to break down to use to produce the energy it needs for its reactions. So we recognize carbohydrates as breads, potatoes, pastas, starchy foods contain a lot of carbohydrates. And this is, again, when we think about the most important ones, carbohydrates do represent the body's primary energy currency. When we think about carbs, carbs do exist actually, though, on different levels, and we'll talk about them more in just a moment. They are sugars as well as larger things, and we'll talk about polysaccharides here in just a moment. But again, to reemphasize the idea of this represents energy, you see down here carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. So if you eat a gram of carbohydrates, then your body can get the equivalent of 4 calories of energy it needs to do work. We'll talk about proteins, fats, and alcohols a little bit later, but notice also while we're here, proteins 4, fats have 9, and alcohol has 7. So eating a meal that has 100 grams of carbohydrate in it means you're going to get 400 calories of energy from that. And we'll spend some more time on calories a little bit later. So carbohydrates, when we talk about a carbohydrate, it's actually composed of simple sugars, building blocks called monosaccharides. So if I have a monosaccharide like glucose, then that is one piece. Glucose is one piece. If I have some of them chained together, then I'm going to get larger and larger carbohydrates called polysaccharides. So carbohydrates are going to be either one monosaccharide, one simple sugar, or a bunch of them chained together. So when we use this term monomer, monomer means just single blocks. Polymer means all the blocks put together. So we have some examples here of some monosaccharides and when they chain together, what they form. So in this case, glucose is a monosaccharide, as is fructose. If you chain these together, if there's a chemical bond formed, you produce sucrose or table sugar. So in this case, 2 monosaccharides, 2 of these building blocks, join together to form a disaccharide, which means 2. In this case, they form sucrose. Some other ones, lactose, like you find in milk. So someone who has lactose intolerance can't break the bond that connects the 2 pieces that make up the lactose disaccharide. You may have heard of maltose, and of course we're talking about sucrose already. So you can have monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. You can have disaccharides like sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And notice how all of these are ending in ose. That's the way you can tell we're talking about sugar if it has an ending that ends in ose. Okay, this is just kind of cute. Chemists see sugars molecularly. We see sugars like the foods they make up. And there are some foods that are really high in sugar. And if you think about drinking a soft drink, drinking a can of Coke or something, you'll see on there the amount of sugar it has. and you also can see how many calories it has. And we'll talk again about how to do that math of how you calculate how many calories or how many grams of something is in a food based upon its calorie or gram content. Okay, so you have monosaccharides, you have disaccharides, and you can have polysaccharides, which are a bunch of those monomers chained together. Here you see example of starch. Every one of these looks like little beads, if you will, represents glucose. And you see what starch is. It is a bunch of glucose molecules all chained together. This is why if you break down starch into its simplest pieces, its glucose molecules, it's the glucose that we will process to make energy from. So some plants are going to store excess sugar. They're going to store excess sugar as these large starch molecules. Of course, we can then eat these molecules, eat the potato in this case. We can eat these to release these bonds and to get the energy in the form of sugar. Some plants actually produce a different form of polysaccharide called cellulose, and it looks very similar. You see glucose, 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 glucose. However, there's a bond difference in cellulose to where you can't break down cellulose. If you digest cellulose, like you eat plants, eat lettuce, eat spinach, you can break it down some, but you can't break it down and actually release all these individual sugars. So it stays as a fiber. So when you hear this term, you must get your fiber, well, you can eat cellulose, eat plants, and get your fiber. It has been found that people who eat diets higher in fiber have less colon cancer, less cancer of the large intestines. So it seems like when you can't digest it and you must muscle that through your intestines, that lowers your cancer risk for colon cancer. So as long as you have the the enzymes to break down a particular polysaccharide, you can get energy from it. We can do that with starch. We can't do that with cellulose. Let me give you one more example of a polysaccharide, glycogen. This is a form we put together to store our extra energy. Let's say you eat a meal and you got plenty of energy that you can need to power your cells, and there's energy left over. You may actually chain together some of those extra glucose molecules as glycogen and store that in your liver and store that in your muscles. It's kind of like standby energy just in case you need it. So the three main polysaccharides, cellulose, which you can't break down, starch, which is one form of storage of glucose, and then animals use glycogen as their kind of standby energy source. And finally, I want to just mention this topic because it relates to sugar and relates to carbohydrates. What is diabetes, and how does it relate to sugar here? Well, this is insulin, and let me come here. Insulin is produced by the pancreas if you have the right genes to produce it. Here is glucose. So let's say you had a milkshake, let's say you had some French fries, whatever you did, and your body breaks down the big polysaccharides and it breaks down the simple sugars, and eventually you have glucose in your bloodstream. If you have insulin and if you have glucose, your body is then going to, the cells of your body are going to take up this complex, and you're going to use the glucose to make your cells work. So if you have the right healthy balance of insulin, because you have a functional pancreas, then you don't have type 1 diabetes. In other words, you have a meal, you'll release the right amount of insulin, you will take the extra sugar out of your bloodstream, your cells will use it, everything is good, everything is normal. So that is the normal case. However, if someone has diabetes, then type 1 diabetes, then there's no insulin available. They have a problem. They can't produce insulin. So they eat a meal, as the other person did, and glucose enters their bloodstream from their digestive system as we'd expect it would. However, this sugar can't go into the cells. The cells can't take it up. insulin is a way of kind of carrying the sugar into our cells so we can use it. If that's in the case of or diabetes, they can't do it, then the sugar builds up to unhealthy amounts. And this, when you have excess sugar in your bloodstream, that's when you see the effects of type 1 diabetes. It can cause issues with the brain, issues with the kidneys, issues with the eyes and other parts of the body. So if someone's a type 1 diabetic, like you see here, they don't produce insulin. And so for them to stay alive, they're going to have the right levels of insulin continually entered into their body. And that's why people who are diabetic have to monitor and prick their fingers to check their blood to make sure they have the right levels of insulin and the right levels of sugar so that they don't go too high or too low on their blood sugar levels. Okay, so that's carbohydrates and sort of an introduction to molecular energy. The next video, we will survey briefly proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Thank you.